Okay, here we go again, Module 3, where we're going to go into managing data governance. And we've talked a little bit in previous modules on retention policies, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper since data governance and information retention kind of go hand in hand like peanut butter and jelly. So when we're talking about configuring information retention in M365, we're really talking about the retention of objects like email, SharePoint data, and even Skype's and Teams data. And the intent is to retain that core workload data for a period of time. This is going to help us comply proactively with any industry regulations or internal policies that we must adhere to, whether that guidance is retaining information for a minimum period of time, like, say, following the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or retaining certain types of content for a certain period of years. It's also going to help us reduce our risk of any litigation. So if you are following a regulatory compliance standard like a Sarbanes-Oxley or even a PCI DSS, you're likely subject to regular third-party and even internal audit by your organization or by another organization. And so this helps ensure and protect your organization in the event of any litigation or security breach by ensuring that you have that data in alignment with that retention policy, but also that data that you do not need to keep any longer after the policy has lapsed, then you can go ahead and permanently delete that content you're no longer required to keep. Obviously, we want to help the organization share that knowledge effectively and be more agile, and this is going to help by ensuring that your users only are leveraging the content that is needed and relevant to them. And there's a couple different methods that we can go about retaining that information, and of course the first one being a retention policy. And we've gone over this in a previous module, but just to recap, retention policies retain the data over a period of time, or they can allow you to delete data after a period of time that has passed. This supports all of the core workloads as well as Teams, and it does require an E3 or E5 license or a Plan 2 license for Exchange Online or SharePoint Online, depending on what workload you're going to be focusing on, but it does need that Plan 2 license if you're not sitting on a suite license like an E3 or an E5. Now, the capabilities for retention policies are going to include, targeted email boxes and distribution groups for Exchange Online. This also includes public folder data. For SharePoint, you've got targeted data at the site level as well. For OneDrive, this can be targeted against an individual account or user or group of accounts. For Skype, this is off by default, but if you were to enable it for Skype, you can target individual user accounts as well. For Teams, this focuses on channel messages, and you can set exclusions for specific teams for chats, or you can also include or exclude individual accounts as well. And then lastly, Office 365 groups. You can target by the group and apply the policy to that group directly as well. And if you want to find out more information on all things retention policies, you can click the link to learn more. And then, of course, next, and this also goes in hand with retention policies, are those retention labels. The labels are going to allow users to leverage a label to retain certain types of data in Office apps. A label is basically a classification standard, if you will. You can also apply the labels automatically based on certain conditions that are set. Now, if you're going to use conditions, that does require an E5 license. Labels are used across the different core workloads as well, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and groups. However, retention labels do not currently work for Teams. You have to use retention policies for Teams, not the labels. A couple of added notes here to kind of foot stomp and just put your mind on is you could leverage the data governance dashboard to see if your policies and labels are being effectively used or not. Governance data is available for up to 90 days, which means if you need it longer than that, you need to plan on retaining that data before it's gone. And for our first demonstration of this module, we're going to go in a little bit deeper on configuring retention labels. All right, here we are. We're in our demonstration environment again, and we're back at the Security and Compliance Center or that protection.office.com webpage. The place we're going to go here is we're going to go under that classification drop down, as you can see here. And as you can see, we've got 3 option types, retention labels, of course, being one of them. We're going to go ahead and click that. And you can see here we can start off by just creating a label, and that's where we're going to start our objective here. And if you remember our retention policy module, we did something along the lines of retaining data for 5 years. We're going to do something very similar here as well. We're going to call it a 5-year retention label. And then we are going to go ahead and go forward. Now, as you can see here, the name is, of course, a required field. You can provide a description for technical admins with privileged access, as well as a description for end users as well, if they are going to be leveraging workloads that this label is going to apply to. As you can see here, there are what are called file plan descriptors. These file plan descriptors are going to be leveraged based on the conditions that we set in this particular phase of our wizard. And so you can see here we can leverage plan descriptor reference IDs, categories, as well as the authority type and the provision that's going to be leveraged to cite that particular descriptor. So if you have any of that information, you can go ahead and apply it here based on additional metadata, but you can proceed and go into the label settings, because that's where we're really going to get into the meat and potatoes on what this label can do. So first and foremost, you're going to see that if you want to apply the settings to the label, you can turn the policy on or off. If you leave it off, then you can go through and create the label with no particular settings, kind of pointless. So you're going to want to go ahead and toggle this on so you can apply the specific information you want to that particular label. Now, if you recall our retention policy wizard and demonstration, some of the steps you see here are pretty straightforward. We want to retain the content for a period of time. For how long? It's either forever or for a period of time. I think we specified in our title of the policy that we wanted to retain information for 5 years. And then after that period of time, well, what do we want to do? Do we want to leave it alone? Do we want to trigger a disposition review? A disposition review in the terms of this wizard is where an admin reviews the items that have reached the end of retention and decide whether or not they can be safely deleted or not. Sometimes for more regulated organizations, this disposition review could be conducted by an outside entity or a legal department to confirm that the information that has passed that period of time can be deleted. Call it a safety measure, if you will. For the purpose of this demonstration, we're just going to go ahead and delete the content after that 5-year period because we're not doing anything fancy here. If we want to provide additional label classifications, we can do that here as well and label content as a record. Records are a term used in a lot of organizations to classify a lot of different types of data based on policies and settings that that organization uses to define a record. So if your organization classifies some of the Office content, SharePoint data, OneDrive data, email data as an official record, then you may want to go ahead and check this box here, because this information, if classified as a record, users won't be able to edit or delete the content or change or remove that label, but they'll be able to look at that, other content and stuff like that. So this is more for that official stamp on data that you guys are going to be applying this retention label against and making sure that it is in fact a record. So that's what that last step there is based on. And then of course, if you're going to retain or delete the content, that last step here is based on the creation date, last modified date, when the label was applied. In many cases, the default option is when it was created, but your organization may have different types of settings that would qualify when the clock starts on a retention label on a certain set of data. When we're done with these steps, we'll click Next. Our last step of the wizard, as you can see here, each one of these wizard steps can be modified. And once we're happy with all of the selections that we've made, we simply click Create this label. All right, so as you can see there, we've got our retention label configured, and we can specify whether we wish to publish a label. And when we publish a label, that's basically saying that we're going to go ahead and take the label that we've just created and apply it to the content that we want to specify. So we would just simply select a label, go in, specify what we want to apply that label against. You can either apply it to everything, or you can choose specific locations, much similar to how we did our retention policy, where we can specify those locations and the content. Notice again, those retention labels, Teams is not an option here, but in retention policies, Teams is an option. So just be mindful when you're looking at perhaps those exam type questions, where we talk about looking at retaining Teams content, retention policies is going to be your answer there. So going through here, we can get specific, we can get broad, and say apply it to everything. For the purpose of this demo, we're just going to go ahead and apply it to everything. We're now going to give it a name, and we're basically just giving a label policy a name. And so we'll call it a 5-year label retention label policy, and same thing there. Go through, and now we're going to publish the label. When you do that, you'll notice that in the retention labels area, there's actually 2 tabs, one for the labels themselves and then the other for the label policy. When you refresh that page, you'll see here now that the 5-year retention label policy has been applied. So a couple things to note here. First, a label itself is not the actual application or enforcement of the retention label. The retention label just simply defines the terms of the retention. The label policy applies that label against what workloads and services you would want that label to be applied against, and that is called a label policy. So that's the demo. I hope that helped, and let's move on. All right, so for our next section of the module, we're going to be talking about planning for M365 Backup. Now, when we talk on-prem data, this is a pretty straightforward process. We're going to look at our servers, we're going to look at the storage on those servers, and that we are going to ensure that we back that up on a regular basis, and that's where we start getting into conversations on full backups, differential backups, and incremental backups. When we talk about M365, it's a little bit different. Many organizations assume that their data backup needs are being met using M365. When we talk about backup in M365, we're not talking traditional backup. We're talking about the policies and the retention methods that we can use to ensure proper protection of that M365 service data. So much like on-premises Exchange, when we're talking about Exchange Online, M365 is using database availability groups, or DAGs. And if you're familiar with Exchange On-Prem 2010 and up, DAGs are not a new concept or architectural framework with regards to how Exchange is designed and set up. The way the DAGs work is that you store your data in multiple data centers across multiple geographies with regards to M365. So those database availability groups are dispersed all over the place. Now, despite this level of redundancy, you're still responsible for your mailbox data. And so here's a couple things that you want to do to ensure the continuity of that Exchange Online data. First and foremost is the recover deleted items. This is a defaulted policy that says once an item is deleted, they're stored in a recoverable items bin for 14 days by default, and that can be extended up to 30 days. This allows admins to go in and recover permanently deleted items that users delete from their mailbox. The second is litigation hold, or lit hold. Now, when a reasonable expectation of litigation is going to exist within an organization, that organization is going to be required to preserve electronically stored information, or ESI, which includes email that's relevant to the case. So if somebody's being sued, for example, and they are querying and putting a subpoena out for content that that user may have been subjected to, that person's mailbox is going to be included in that subpoena because they've probably sent a lot of things, possibly evidence, electronically. This expectation often exists before the specifics of the case are known, and preservation is often broad and necessary. So there's a few measures that organizations can take to help preserve mail. First off is simply asking end users to preserve mail by not deleting the messages. This does create a little bit of risk because users can still go in and delete email knowingly or inadvertently. Another option is the suspension of automated deletion mechanisms such as messaging records management. This can result in large volumes of email being preserved, but it can also clutter the user mailbox and thus impacting their productivity. Suspending automated deletion doesn't prevent users from also manually deleting their email as well. Another option is taking the email content and moving it to archive so that it can't be deleted, can't be altered or tampered with. One con to this is that it will increase some costs due to the manual efforts required to copy or move messages, and obviously that stuff has to sit somewhere and consume storage resources. In either way, if we can't preserve email, that can really expose risk to the organization from a legal and financial standpoint. If there is a litigation case or legal case against an individual or organization, and that can really add scrutiny to the organization's ability to maintain record or discovery, and can additionally incur legal sanctions, judgments, or fines to that organization if they're supposed to follow a certain type of regulatory compliance. Now, when we're talking about archiving data, this does have a licensing stipulation to it. We have to require an Exchange Online Plan 2 or E3 license or higher to achieve this. Mailboxes have a 100 gigabyte limit with these plans. However, you can go through Microsoft through a support request to request an increase on that mailbox limit if needed. For some of the lower plans, like an E1 or Business Premium or Business Essentials, the limit on archive mailboxes is going to be set to only 50 gigabytes. Now, for SharePoint Online, the first thing we want to talk about is versioning. Versioning is a really good way to keep data continuity intact. Every time a document is updated or saved, a new version is created of that document. And you can have up to 50,000 major versions and 511 minor versions established when you enable versioning. Now, the default is 500 major versions, which is quite a lot. The other thing to note here is that major and minor versions are disabled by default. So you have to go in here and turn versioning on to begin with. However, it's important to note that when you would work on a document in SharePoint on-prem, you would check in or check out that document so that you would allow a one-to-one interaction with the document and prevent anybody else from coming in, making inadvertent or unnecessary edits while you were working on that document. However, in SharePoint Online, you have what's called co-authoring. Co-authoring simply just means that you can have multiple individuals working on the same document collaboratively. And so there is no checkout or check-in process enabled if you wish to co-author a document. Luckily, checkout is disabled by default, but if you were to turn that on, you're essentially disabling co-authoring. The other is, of course, deleted items recoverability. By default, deleted items are retained for 93 days for SharePoint Online data. Now, for example, if you delete an item and it's stored in the recycle bin for, say, 50 days, and then it's deleted, it's only going to remain in the site collection recycle bin for 43 days. So the real key takeaway here is that the site collection data is maintained for 93 days. And of course, we're talking OneDrive for Business. OneDrive for Business has a simple file restoration process where we can allow the users to go into OneDrive Online and restore data that they've deleted from up to 30 days ago. And of course, recovering of deleted items. The recycle bin maintains data for up to 93 days as well, which follows the similar guideline for SharePoint Online. Because remember, when we're talking OneDrive for Business in Office 365, we're really talking about all of that data sitting in a back-end SharePoint library anyway. For our next demonstration, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into one of these options by creating an archive mailbox. All right, so we're back inside of Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. For this demonstration, we are going to go down to the Information Governance drop-down here, and we are going to scroll down to Archive. So as you can see here, we're in our Archive mailbox section inside of Security and Compliance, and you're going to see here a list of the mailboxes that we currently have set up. For this demonstration, we're just going to set it up on mine, but you can see on the table here, Archive mailbox status for me is disabled. Pretty straightforward process of creating an archive mailbox. I'm going to start this process by simply clicking Enabled. It says if you enable this person's archive mailbox, items in their mailbox that are older than 2 years will be moved into the archive. Do you wish to continue? and simply state yes. You can see here on the current plan that I have what the current mailbox usage is going to be set at. So obviously this is a demo environment, so we don't have a lot of data in there, but for your large-scale production environments, you may have a lot of data in there. And now, as you can see, the archive mailbox is now enabled, and we can see now we have a couple of different windows here. We can see statistics on archive usage and recoverable items usage. So as content reaches a certain age, it will start to populate into here, so we can provide some additional tracking and metrics on making sure that archive mailboxes are in fact enabled. And just like that, we've gone through and we've created an archive mailbox in very simplistic fashion. All right, so we're going to go back to back here, and for our next demonstration, we're going to go into configuring document versioning inside of SharePoint Online. All right, so I'm inside of my M365 demo environment again, and for those of you that may not necessarily be familiar with SharePoint, there's a couple of steps here to go into, but at the end of the day, you really need to go into your document library. The document library that you want to enable versioning on is where you want to go here, and you may have multiple document libraries or site collections and things like that. So for the purpose of this demonstration, we're going to go into our library settings for that particular document library, and we're going to set up versioning that way. So if you are a global admin and you're just not familiar with all of the things that are in SharePoint, you can simply click on the Admin Center for SharePoint, go under your sites, and look at your active sites. And you can see there's a URL for all of your active sites there, and you can actually click on that and it'll take you to that area. Now, I've already taken the liberty of clicking the all company site, and all I'm doing here is it'll take you kind of to the main home page, and this is the entire site library. And so we want to go into our site contents, and at this point we've got a variety of different document libraries. So say we want to create a versioning setup for our documents. Once we have the appropriate document library selected, we're simply going to go to the little gear up here in the upper right-hand corner and go down to Library Settings. And within Library Settings, there's a lot of different URL options we can select from, but the one right here, Versioning Settings, is where we're going to go next. And as you can see here, we have a lot of different options here. We can specify whether new items or changes to existing items should remain in a draft state until they have been approved. So do we want to create content approval essentially? And that's a yes or no. It's off by default. And then we can get into versioning history and identifying whether a version is created each time you edit a file. If you want to do major versions, that's the default option. If you want to do minor versions with the major revisions, then you can do that there as well. So basically, you're looking at version 1, version 2, and so on, or version 1, or version 1.1, etc. Once you've specified how you like the versioning to be drafted and displayed, then you would specify the number of major versions. Remember, we talked about the limit being 50,000. Of course, default is 500. You can go beyond that if you really think you're going to be messing around with a lot of these documents for a long duration of time. If you're going to do draft item security, you can say who can see draft items in the document library. Basically, any users read only, or you can only allow users who can edit or approve. And then lastly, require checkout. This is essentially saying, do you want co-authoring enabled or do you want to leverage checkout? And by default, this is turned off, but if you wish to do checkout, you can enable that and proceed forward. But once you're done there, you simply go in here and hit OK, and just like that, you have allowed versioning to be configured and set up on a SharePoint site's document library. Pretty straightforward setup for the most part. For our next section of this module, we are going to talk about planning information retention policies. We've talked labels, we've talked the retention policies themselves, but we have another option as well, and that is through the use of what is called File Plan Manager. File Plan Manager provides advanced management capabilities for retention labels, retention label policies, and provides integrated way to traverse label and label to content activity for the entire content lifecycle, cradle to grave, through record declaration, retention, and even deletion and disposition. Now, if you want to access File Plan Manager, you go into Security and Compliance Center, and we go into Records Management, and there's going to be an option there under File Plan. Now, in order to leverage File Plan Manager, you do have to have some things, and can't do this without certain licensing, obviously. So, first and foremost, you got to have E5. Does require some additional permissions. There's a Retention Manager or View-Only Retention Manager permissions, roles that have to be defined. So the other thing, too, about File Plan Manager that's really cool is that you can also import existing labels into your file plan. This allows you to take those labels into a CSV file with all of the existing labels within your organization and then bring them in through an import process, and this allows for an easier publication of labels within the file plan. So if you were on E5, File Plan Manager is kind of that central point within your organization's M365 environment to manage all things retention. If you're on any licensing plan lower than that, you're perfectly fine with retention labels, retention label policies, or retention policies. But this consolidates everything into a single pane of glass. You're also able to see labels created inside and outside of the specific file plan in question. And then lastly, of course, bring in additional descriptor information, a little bit more granularity into those retention labels themselves through the File Plan Manager. Now, if you want to dive into additional information on File Plan Manager and the navigation of your file plan, you can click on the links in either one of these columns on this slide to learn more. And with that said, let's dive into our last demonstration of the module, which is File Plan Manager Policies. All right, here we are again inside of Security and Compliance Center in M365. For File Plan Manager, we're going to go under Records Management, and we are going to select File Plan just like we did when we were describing the previous slide. Now, you can see here, there is my retention label we created earlier in the module, and then under File Plan Actions, we have some options. Say I've got a lot of different retention labels already defined, I can simply go in and import the file plan. This gives you all of the steps from getting that CSV file downloaded, getting guidance on how to fill out the template, which will take you to a document library article on how to leverage the CSV to ensure proper formatting and all that. And then getting the CSV imported in, and then you can actually publish and auto-apply those labels directly. We're not going to import. We're just simply going to go through and actually create a label through the File Plan Manager. And as you can see here, it's the same thing. We're going through here and we're creating another retention label. So we'll call this one a 7-year retention label. Hit Next. We're going to skip our file descriptors this time. We're going to go through here. We're going to go ahead and set up our retention policy. We're going to go ahead and classify this data as records and then go through here, create the label. One thing to note here that's a little bit different than our retention label section is that we have a status indicator next to our labels. And we can see here that the one that is inactive or active. So for this one, we can simply go through and we can say, much like we did before, publish the label. Go through the same wizard as we've done before. We're going to select our 7-year retention label. We're going to go through and hit Done, Next, allow us to choose specific locations. At this point in time, we're going to say we're going to only apply this to SharePoint content. And then we're going to call this the 7-year SharePoint Online content label, and then go through and publish the label. And as you can see here, this will go through and complete. We'll refresh, and then you can see our policies are now active. And if I want to go through here and make any kind of modification, I simply double click it. I can go through and make modifications to an existing policy, republish it if needed. Which again, if my retention policies are going to be based on when it was labeled, if it gets relabeled, the clock could restart, so you may want to specify some more specifics there. But getting into File Plan Management through the use of policies is a good way to go here. And as you can see, once I refreshed, I can see now my retention label policies as well. And just like that, we've gone through and we have set up retention label policies and retention labels using File Plan Manager. And one more thing to note about File Plan Manager is if you wish to click and learn more, you can actually click the little informational widget box there, and it'll give you more information about File Plan as well. Again, very similar demonstration and setup leveraging File Plan Manager. We are done with module. There's only 2 more to go, folks, and we are done with this course. By now, you've got to be getting sick and tired of my voice, but guess what? We're going to press on because that's what we are. We're warriors. We're going to keep going forward, and we're going to go into Module 4, which is going to be on managing auditing. Really exciting stuff. Okay, maybe not, but that's okay. We're going to get through auditing, and then we're going to proceed towards our last module, and it's going to be awesome.